Welcome. Today is part 2 of a series of webinars presented by Palm Springs Life in conjunction with SBEMP Attorneys at Law as we navigate our new normal and move into the community. Our first seminar dealt with while we were in phase 2, and now 4 weeks later, we're moving into phase 3. I am Valerie Powers-Smith, partner at SBEMP Attorneys at Law, and I also chair our Trust Estate, Probate, and Special Needs and Elder Law departments. I'm joined today by fellow partner B. Sotelo, who chairs our Employment and Labor Department. So now we're looking at what are the issues that are facing employers and employees, and how are we navigating that now we're in phase 3, but amidst a threat that we may be pulled back to phase 2 because of the increased detection of COVID-19. So let's focus first. What is our new normal, B?
Normal indeed. I don't know that we can even call it normal. It's what we consider our normal, but we're looking at issues that we've never seen before, and that's because we've never lived in times like this before. So what I'm seeing in terms of our employer clients and employees calling me seeking help as well, lots of COVID issues, lots of issues arising out of the social unrest, issues such as employees calling in to report that they now have COVID. How do employers respond to that? We also have many employers who are grappling with employees who want to return to work but are unable to because children's schools and daycares and sitters are still unavailable. Then we have other employees who are being called back to work, being offered work, but are declining work because under the CARES Act, they're now making $600 more a week in unemployment. And those workers are finding that it's more cost beneficial to them to stay home. So how do employers grapple with that? They can't compete with that. And then we have employees who are hesitant to return to work because they fear that the workplace may not be safe enough for them, or they fear bringing COVID back home to high-risk family members. And then as if that wasn't enough, we have employers who are grappling with employees who are taking time off to participate in protests. And then we have employers just thinking, gosh, do I need to respond to this social climate? Do I need to issue a public statement about social inequalities? So these are issues that we've never really had to confront before. But now, as you mentioned, they are part of our new normal.
So why don't we break down what are the issues with employers bringing their employees back that you're seeing?
So now that we're in phase 3 and even the high-risk businesses are threatening or allowed to reopen, how do we deal with bringing employees back and the issues that come with employees when they come back? So let's look at the complaint that I'm hearing from employers about employees not wanting to return to work because they can make more sitting at home collecting unemployment. And in many ways, you want to say to these employees, think unemployment is not going to last you forever, whereas your job potentially could, so come back to work. But you're talking about people who are really struggling right now, and that $600 a week under the CARES Act is really beneficial to them. Unfortunately, in California, if an employee is being offered a reasonable job offer and the work is available and they decline it, then they will no longer qualify for unemployment benefits. So employers, that's a tool that you can use. You can let your employees know if you don't return to work, I have an obligation to contact the EDD within 10 days and notify them that I've issued a reasonable offer for reinstatement and you've declined it. And by the way, the EDD will do this on its own anyway. It will reach out to employers who have employees who are collecting unemployment every now and then to let them know this is how much this employee is getting, this is how much longer the benefits will last. And if you, employer, get one of those notices and you know that you've offered this employee his or her job back and the employee is refusing to return to work, you can fill out that form notifying the EDD that this employee has refused a reasonable job offer. And the EDD will then contact the employee and let him know that his unemployment benefits will no longer be issued by the state of California.
Is there some detail that you want to add about what a reasonable offer to the employee to work would look like?
Sure. If you are calling an employee to offer the employee a job, You have to make it clear that this is a job offer. You have to make it clear to the employee that you're offering to reinstate the employee. How do you make it clear? You say just that. This is a job offer. When does it start? You're expected to report to work Monday morning at 8 o'clock in your old position or in a new position. So give the employee specifics. What's the job? When is the employee expected to work? Is it the employee's old position? And if there are any changes, let the employee know. As long as it's clear to a third party like the EDD that you are telling this employee, I'm giving you your job back, you need to come back to work, then you've satisfied your obligation. That's a reasonable job offer.
Is the EDD concerned with what you may, as an employer, communicate to an employee as to what precautions or protocols you have in place to protect them from COVID-19?
No, the EDD is not concerned with that, but every employer in the United States right now should be concerned with what precautions are in the workplace. And that leads us to the next issue, and that is if you don't take these precautions and you don't take these cautionary advisories from the government carefully, or you don't abide by them, now in California, governments will fine you. Whether it's local, state, or otherwise, they will fine you. In fact, before we started filming, we were talking about a local restaurant who is facing significant fines because there are pictures posted all over the internet of the restaurant's employees and patrons standing shoulder to shoulder, no face mask, no social distancing. So what precautions should an employer take? Well, the ones that we know about are obvious and clear, right? It's make sure everyone has face masks, make sure you enforce the face mask, make sure everyone understands social distancing practices. Believe it or not, there are still some people who don't fully understand what it means to social distance. For example, many of you have heard that McDonald's, Amazon, Smithfield Foods have been hit with these gigantic public nuisance lawsuits. It's a novel new theory that plaintiffs' attorneys have used during COVID-19. The standard is lower for them to meet. And how that works is they're not saying that McDonald's or Amazon or Smithfield are just ignoring their COVID-19 duties. What they're saying is these companies are not doing enough. What they are doing is ineffective, and the result is that their employees are contracting COVID and then bringing it home to their family members, who then spread it throughout the community. So they're using a theory that up until now people have been using to sue toxic waste dumps or Chevron for dumping oil in the ocean. They're saying, what these plaintiffs are saying is that these companies are not taking effective measures to contain the COVID and creating a public nuisance because their employees who need to work to survive are getting COVID because of these ineffective measures, and are then spreading it throughout the community. So as we're talking about examples of what employers are doing effectively and not doing effectively, in the McDonald's public nuisance lawsuit in Illinois, just this morning, a judge issued a preliminary injunction against McDonald's, a McDonald's franchise, for not doing enough to contain what the plaintiffs are calling a public nuisance. Significantly, when the judge issued that preliminary injunction, she found that McDonald's had taken significant steps to protect its employees. Unfortunately, they're not enough. The judge specifically stated that she saw evidence that whereas McDonald's had a policy that required face masks, had a policy that required social distancing, increased the amounts of hand washing stations in all of their restaurants, are providing hand sanitizer, providing face masks. Yet she found that this was not enough. Why? Because she also saw a lot of evidence from employees who are testifying that in practice, the face mask wearing and the social distancing are not being enforced. Employees are saying regularly they are showing up to work wearing masks, but throughout their shift, the masks, when they're working the hot kitchens, the masks get hot, they stretch out, they fall off, it's uncomfortable, employees take it off. And these employees are saying no manager is stepping up to say you need to put the mask back on. You need to stay 6 feet from each other. They're seeing it happen and just allowing it to happen. And quite frankly, when you work in that tiny kitchen, how can you maintain 6 feet of social distancing? But the judge is saying to McDonald's, figure it out, because face masks and social distancing are so critical to save human lives right now. You cannot have this policy and not enforce it. So you absolutely have to enforce it. So again, whereas you think you may be doing enough, you might want to listen to your employees. They will tell you when they think something is not enough. I know just here in the firm, we get some employees complaining that others are forgetting to put their mask on when they leave their office. So it's a constant reinforcement on top of just having the policy. Having the policy is not enough. You've got to show that you're actively reinforcing these things. And then, I know many employers are dealing with issues of employees who are great employees, have always been, but now all of a sudden are saying, I'm not coming back to work. I just don't feel safe. I have high-risk parents that I'm living with. My husband is older. My mom had cancer. So previously, we saw many employers just, take a hardline stance and say, this is your job. If you refuse to come into work, I'm going to consider it job abandonment. Maybe I'll write you up a few times and then you're fired. But I caution employers not to do that in today's climate, because some of these employees legitimately have a reason to fear coming into work. And if the fear is because they have an inherent disability, or they have some sort of compromised immune system, can also be a disability, and they're afraid to come into the workplace and catch COVID and bring it back to other high-risk members, then you as the employer have the obligation to try and accommodate that disability if you can. If you just never talk to the employee about what the disability is, never talk to the employee about what kind of accommodations the employee might need and what kind of accommodations you, the employer, can provide, and you just terminate this employee for refusing to come into work, you may be facing a disability discrimination lawsuit. And while we're talking about discrimination, let's talk about a real fact of life these days, and that is employees not being able to work because childcare is not available is a very real concern. And by the way, we're seeing that this difficulty disproportionately affects women in the workplace. So again, employer, if you just brush aside that consideration, not give it a second thought, and your response to an employee saying, I'm unable to work because I have childcare issues, please work with me. If your response to that is, you are required to be here, and if you're not here, I'm going to write you up and then fire you. Again, you may be facing another discrimination issue, because as we just discussed, childcare issues seems to be disproportionately affecting women in the workplace. So you could be just thumbing your nose at all of your female employees who are unable to work because of childcare issues.
So you've addressed clearly how do you affect, as an employer, an employee who's not coming back because of unemployment, financial gain. You've also addressed how can you deal with employees who feel unsafe. What would be sort of the cardinal rule that you would give to employers with the last two scenarios that you've discussed? Because now it's bringing in disability discrimination concerns and gender discrimination concerns.
Thank you for asking that. It really forces employers to focus when I tell them the cardinal rule is interactive process. For those of you who don't know what that is a term of art used in the Americans with Disabilities Act. And what that requires is when you, the employer, notice that your employee has a disability, has an issue that is interfering with his or her ability to perform the job, rather than immediately jump to, well, if she can't do her job, I need to write her up, then I need to fire her, you engage in the interactive process. And that really is just having a discussion, a two-way discussion with your employee in which she tells you, honestly and frankly, what her issues are. She lets you know what she thinks accommodations might be useful in order to allow her to perform her job. And you, the employer, take that information, process it, but then you have an obligation to go back to the employee and say, we can offer this accommodation, that accommodation, unfortunately, we can't do. We don't have enough people to offer you an assistant, but work with the employee. Have the interactive dialogue so that you know what it is she needs and you tell her what it is that you can provide. That will go a long way in showing any judge or jury or arbitrator that rather than just fire the employee for not being able to work, you actually listen to her and actually try to work with her to provide the accommodation to allow her to continue working despite the difficulties.
That's great advice, Grace. So now let's shift our focus. Once employees are back at work, what issues have you heard coming up now again?
Oh my God.
Normal?
So many. So obviously the biggest is, what do I do when my employee calls and says, I have COVID-19? So we discussed this at length last time. I won't go over too much detail, but again, employer, your obligations are immediately identify all other employees who have had prolonged close contact with the affected employee. Again, reminder, prolonged close contact means contact that is closer than 6 feet. In other words, you're not maintaining the social distance. And it's lasting for 10 to 15 minutes or more. So you need to notify all of those employees. Remember to keep the affected employee's identification private and confidential. Then you need to wait 24 hours and go in and clean and disinfect the affected employee's workstation. And remember to provide emergency paid sick leave. Remember, the employee is sick. She may not be thinking, oh my gosh, what kind of leaves am I entitled to? She's just thinking about not dying and getting better. So when the CARES Act was passed earlier this year, all employers had an obligation to post in the workplace that certain leaves were available under the CARES Act. Employers, if you haven't done that already, you should immediately do so. And if you have an employee who's sick, you should be the one contacting her and saying, under these circumstances, you qualify for emergency paid sick leave. Let me send you the leave form. Let me show you what needs to be filled out. And put the employee on leave. She's entitled to it. It's paid leave. If she's sick, she's entitled to it. By the way, we as California businesses have operated for a long time under the California general rule that we respect our employees' privacy at pretty much at all costs. So if an employee calls in and tells us she's sick, we don't have necessarily, unless it's FMLA or CFLA leave, which is an extended period of time. If it's just regular sick leave for 3 days, we don't have the right to ask for a doctor's note if an employee just calls in sick. However, as we said, COVID has changed our normal. That's not the normal anymore. COVID-19 has been declared a direct threat to the lives, the health and lives of all citizens of the United States. And when you have a direct threat, that gives you a little bit more leeway. So you can ask for a doctor's note. And in fact, under the CARES Act, you have to ask. When an employee gets emergency paid sick leave or expanded paid family leave, you have to back that up with written documentation. So you must tell the employee, get a doctor's note so I can include it with the paperwork. For the employee whose kids' schools are closed, that employee has to produce something from the school district or a school official, and it can be something as simple as a note posted on the district's or the school's website that you can turn into your employer to prove that the school was closed. And employers, please, 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 if you never maintain good records in your life, now is the time to do it. Because these records, every doctor's note, every note showing the school is closed, is going to be required in order for you to get tax credits for the leaves that you provide to your employees pursuant to the CARES Act.
It sounds like there's a lot more considerations and a lot more issues that employers need to consider in the category of leave for their employees. How do they navigate knowing whether or not an employee qualifies under the old system that they were used to, or now of its COVID-19 extensions of leave or new leave policies?
That's such a good question, Val, because it's such a nuanced analysis. It always was. When our employer or employees, when do employees qualify for emergency paid sick leave, for expanded family leave? So the key term is because of COVID-19. The way the statutes read, employees are eligible or are qualified for emergency paid sick leave if they are unable to work because of a stay-at-home order, or unable to work because they are sick with COVID-19, or unable to work because they have to care for a family member with COVID-19, or because they have to care for children whose school are closed because of COVID-19. Now, that because of phrase really does get turned on its head. If you just look at the emergency paid sick leave provision, on its face, it says if an employee cannot work because of a stay-at-home order, he or she is entitled to 10 days of emergency paid sick leave. Well, that could mean everybody in the United States who's currently under a stay-at-home order. But the EEOC and the Department of Labor have clarified that in order for an employee to qualify for emergency paid sick leave, the stay-at-home order must be preventing the employee from being able to work. In other words, if an employee is able to telecommute despite a stay-at-home order, that employee does not get emergency paid sick leave. And remember, even at the height of the pandemic, essential businesses were allowed to stay open, and even non-essential businesses were allowed to keep a small group of essential employees at its premises to keep the business running. So if you were an essential worker or you were one of those essential employees of a non-essential business, you were still working despite stay-at-home orders and not entitled to emergency paid sick leave. So the example that the Department of Labor uses, which I'll use now because it explains it the best, is you have a cashier who works in a coffee shop. If the coffee shop closed its doors because the pandemic has caused its customers to no longer want to go out and hang out in a coffee shop and order coffee, and so the coffee shop closed because it no longer has business, and as a result, the employee lost her job, she's not entitled to emergency paid sick leave. She didn't lose her job because of a stay-at-home order preventing her from work. But if the employee is a non-essential employee, she's not required to be at work to keep the business going. She's a cashier at a coffee shop. She's not an essential worker, and there's a stay-at-home order that's not allowing her to go into work. That employee is entitled to emergency paid sick leave. So it's a very nuanced analysis, which if you have any questions, call us. We're happy to walk you through it. But we're seeing lawsuits already arising out of this. Employers are not doing the analysis properly and denying employees leave. So in this category, we're seeing lawsuits attacking employers for denying leave wrongfully, for interfering with leave wrongfully. For example, if you know an employee is home caring for her child, but you're calling 18 times a day wanting to know when she was going to get a babysitter and when she can return to work, you're interfering with her leave. And in addition, we're seeing, I don't want to scare all the employers by thinking it's just all gloom and doom with the lawsuits. We're also seeing public agencies, government agencies that are enforcing discrimination, harassment laws in the workplace. We're also seeing them adopt a much more relaxed standard when it comes to determining whether an employer has acted reasonably. And let me give you an example. Previously, as I said, in California especially, we considered employees' privacy sacrosanct. We did everything we could to uphold an employee's expectation of privacy in the workplace. However, now with COVID-19, and as we discussed, it's considered a direct threat to human life, we're seeing public agencies saying, okay, employees, you have to understand that we've got to balance your privacy with your employer's right to protect its other employees. So what does that mean? That means before, when an employee submitted a vacation request, you either approved it or didn't approve it, depending on whether you needed the employee to be at work those 2 weeks. Now, you also get to ask the employee where you're going, how long you're staying, is that a high-risk place? Because you have an obligation to protect your workplace, and you don't want this employee going to some high-risk place and then bringing, on vacation no less, and then bringing COVID back into your workplace. We've had employers tell employees, and this is perfectly lawful, that if you're going to Mexico, many employees are submitting vacation requests for the summer in which they're going to Mexico. Why? Because Cabo and Cancun are the only 2 beaches that are open in the world right now. So many employees are going to Mexico. Many employers, in response, are researching and saying, wait a second, the border to Mexico and the border to Canada is closed to non-essential travel. And if you travel to Mexico and you come back, the US government requires that you quarantine for 14 days. So you're telling me you're going to Mexico for a vacation. Do you have enough vacation time built up to cover not only your quarantine, but your vacation time? If you don't, we can't approve it. So we're seeing some relaxation in the standards imposed on employers on what they can do. But, don't go crazy with it. Bear in mind that what we're looking at is how reasonably employers respond to this pandemic and how reasonably they're responding to their employees' concerns.
And can employers ask for certifications or documentations, whether it's the employee qualifies under the CARES Act for leave or under the extended family leave?
Yes. In fact, the expanded family leave is part of the CARES Act. And so, yes, you can require, as we discussed earlier, you can require documentation if an employee says, I need 10 weeks off because my child's school is closed and the summer daycare program is closed, then yes, you will have to submit a note to your employer to show that the school is closed and the daycare facility is closed. And the documentation, the DOL has been very specific about this. The documentation must contain the name of the employee, how long the employee expects to be out, the specific dates, the name of the child that's being cared for, an attestation that the school or daycare facility is closed, and that's supported by the documentation. And they've even gone so far as to say if you're telling your employer that you need the expanded family leave to stay home and care for a child who's already over 14 and presumably could care for himself, then you need to say on your request form what the special circumstances are that require you to have to stay home with a child who's over 14.
So I know that we have all been very consumed with the worldwide pandemic, and that seems to have been partially eclipsed by all the civil unrest.
Yes.
Undoubtedly, that has to bring other concerns to employers that are not politically based, but associated with the pandemic while they have employees exercising their rights out during the protests. But is there a concern in how do employers deal with when they know that's happening?
Absolutely.
Exposure of their employees to COVID-19 and
Absolutely.
coming into the workplace.
Absolutely. So let's start with what California law allows and does not allow. California Labor Code Section 1101 specifically prohibits employers from implementing any rule, regulation, or policy that prohibits or prevents its employees from engaging or participating in politics or running for office, and also from controlling, directing, or tending to control or direct your employees' political activities and political affiliations. Then you follow that up with California Labor Code Section 1102, which it says flat out, no employer shall coerce or influence or attempt to coerce or influence his employees through or by means of threat of discharge or loss of employment to require that employee to adopt or follow or refrain from adopting or following a particular line of political action or political activity. We know this, right? But how do we actually implement this in real life? And let me tell you, it's hard. And I've gotten calls from both ends of the aisle, from both sides of the aisle. I got a call from a client who said, I can't believe it. I turned on the TV to watch a protest, and there's my dumb employee with a giant MAGA hat on, walking around trying to be an agitator and provoke people. I'm going to fire him right on the spot when he comes back to work on Monday. And then I've gotten the other employer that's called that said, I get it. I'm all about social equality. I'm all about social justice. But half my workforce just love to go participate in a protest. What can I do? Well, just because California law says that you have to respect your employees' political affiliations and their political activities does not mean that you just neglect the effect that has on the workplace. If you have employees who are just blowing off work to go protest, not calling in to let you know that they're going to be off, not giving any idea, just walking off the job, you can absolutely write that employee up for being a no-call, no-show, for violating the company's attendance policies. And you can address that employee's abrupt leaving from work. If you have an employee who has very strong political opinions and is loud about it at work and pushes his opinions on other employees to the point of being abusive or harassing, you can address that. You have policies that prohibit employees from harassing or being mean to other employees in the workplace simply because of their political beliefs, and you can address that. And yes, you promote social inequality and you want your employees to be able to protest and voice their opinions. But if it disrupts your workplace, you have every right to address it. And you'll hear employees say things like, you can't make me stop talking about Trump. It's my First Amendment right. Well, guess what? First Amendment protects employees from the government. It doesn't protect them from a private employer trying to enforce its own reasonable policies in the workplace. So if, yes, you've got an obnoxious employee who harasses everyone who's not of the same political affiliation, who makes fun of everyone who thinks his candidate is not good enough, then that employee may be harassing other employees at work, and you can absolutely address it in order to keep your workplace comfortable for all other employees. And then this is kind of a strange issue, but it has come up quite a few times in the last month. Employers feel the need to publicly announce a position on the social unrest issues. That's great. I'm glad that the social unrest is making people think about where they fall in the spectrum, making people revisit their ideology and their beliefs to determine if they really do accept social equality, if they've done enough to promote justice for all segments of society. But remember that anything you post on the internet is there forever, and it's really public fodder for everyone else to attack you. So unfortunately, in this past month, I've had several companies call me really upset because they thought they were doing something very nice. They posted a public message condemning racism and social inequality, and yet they're being attacked by bloggers left and right and former employees who are disgruntled, who are calling and saying, no, that's not true, you discriminated against me. Mm-hmm. So my advice is just be very careful about what you put out there. Don't feel the need to have to rush out and publish a statement on social inequality. It's nice that, in fact, it's more than nice. It's great that you're thinking about it, but be careful about what you put on there because people will find a way to come back at you, and it's a real issue that we're dealing with a number of our clients.
That's a great point. I'm sure a lot of employers having a reaction wanting to set the stage wouldn't have considered that.
Right.
So earlier you mentioned a couple of litigation cases with some large employers, including McDonald's and Amazon. What other litigation cases are you seeing come across your desk or in the news that are really novel?
Yeah. So, let's talk about what's not novel. The theories that have always been out there that we're seeing an explosion of lawsuits in which employees are alleging that their employers are simply negligent, just not meeting the standard of care that's required of a reasonable employer to protect their employees in the workplace. For example, we saw a lawsuit out of Oakland. A fast food franchisee up there was refusing to provide face masks even though most of its employees are minimum wage earners from lower strata of society who could use the help in having their employers provide the PPE. And when employees were started to get sick left and right, this employer cut up a bunch of diapers for dogs and had the employees tape it around their heads. That's not efficient. That's not considered reasonable. And that's not meeting your standard of care. The government has seen this. So the U.S. Congress right now is working on a law potentially that could immunize employers from claims of negligence in the workplace during the pandemic. California has done the reverse. California, the governor has issued an executive order declaring a legal presumption that if employees work during COVID-19, they are presumed to have contracted COVID-19 at work, and therefore it's an industrial injury that's compensable through the workers' comp insurer.
For the benefit of our viewers, because there's been a lot of confusion because we have not had the same federal guidance that we've had at the state levels or the cities or the counties. What is the state of the law as we sit here today in terms of mask wearing? Is it recommended or is it mandatory?
Oh my gosh, that's the million dollar question. It changes all the time. So you might recall that some time ago, County of Riverside withdrew its order requiring face masks, hoping that the state would step in and require everyone in the state to wear a face mask, but the state didn't. So for a short period of time, we had a situation in which face masks were recommended heavily by the CDC, but not required in California. That changed last week because of the sharp spikes that we're seeing in COVID cases being reported and in cases of hospitalization in California. So now face masks are required. This morning we discussed what stage are we in. It's unclear. Last we heard, Riverside County had moved into phase 3, but now with the sharp, again, rises in instances of hospitalization and instances of positive cases of COVID being reported, in instances of community spread, hospitals are once again finding that they're slowly filling up again. So now it looks like we might revert back to phase 2. We don't know. We're certainly being threatened with it. So it's hard to keep straight in our heads where we are, what's required. Again, just think reasonably. Just think reasonably. If cases are going up, face masks, social distancing is critical. Make sure you maintain it. And as we discussed earlier, the public nuisance case in which employees are suing McDonald's, we're seeing a federal judge, issue a preliminary injunction because she said, I'm finding that McDonald's has done a lot to protect its employees, but not enough. It's not strictly enforcing social distancing and face mask wearing, and as a result, employees are getting sick. So again, just think reasonably. Think what has been on the forefront of every recommendation that we've seen from every public agency since this pandemic started. Face masks, social distancing. So maintain it as you can. What other claims are we seeing coming out of COVID-19? We're seeing lots of whistleblower claims, employees claiming that they're being terminated for reporting their employers' unsafe working conditions. We're seeing lawsuits alleging privacy violations because employers are releasing names of employees being affected with COVID-19. We're seeing lots of discrimination, retaliation, harassment claims, not just from COVID, but obviously the political affiliation issues. Lots of wage and hour claims. For those of you with employees who are telecommuting, are you ensuring that you provide meal and rest periods? Are you reminding them to take their meal and rest periods and to record it on their timesheets? Are they reporting overtime if they're working from home? And how do you track it? So these are very real concerns. And I know we're talking primarily about employers, but with the big picture, there are lots of lawsuits that are really scaring many, many businesses. Some funny ones, though. Jim Baker, the Reverend Jim Baker, is being sued because he claimed that his silver solution can cure COVID-19, and it can't. The company Germex that makes the hand sanitizers, they're being sued for a false claim because they claim that their hand sanitizer can kill COVID or can prevent COVID-19. Here in the firm, we're seeing a lot of clients grapple with their insurance companies denying their business interruption claims. These poor companies have been diligently paying their premiums for years, relying on the fact that when something catastrophic like this pandemic happens, they will have coverage from their insurance companies for business interruption. And yet we're seeing insurance companies denying those claims left and right. So my prediction is we're going to see many, many bad faith claims arising in the insurance industry.
So what does all of this tell us, V?
So our new normal is fraught with legal pitfalls, but it also tells us that we're seeing our government, both at a local, state level as well as the federal level, we're seeing them adopt a very reasonable response to what we, the citizens, are going through. As I mentioned, they're relaxing the standards of how far we can intrude into employee privacy. They're understanding that right now, many employers are not in the position to offer the benefits that they once offered. And I forgot to mention, many employers who received loans through the Paycheck Protection Program offered by the SBA. That money would be running out right about now. So we're seeing lots of employers who had employees on furlough and then was able to pay employees' wages with a paycheck protection loan, now are saying the money's gone, the PPP loan is gone, I'm still not allowed to reopen at full capacity. In fact, I wasn't allowed to reopen until 2 weeks ago. There's no way I'm going to be able to pay back this loan. There's no way I'm going to be able to run my business the way it ran before COVID. So many employers are just completely revamping their business plan. Restaurants that once were dine-in are now just takeout. Employers that once had 500 employees now have 100. They've completely changed their business models. So if you have to terminate your employees now, it's not going to be fun. It's not going to be anything that anyone loves doing, but now is the time in which everyone understands that employers simply can't operate as usual. So we're adapting to our new normal. Lots of pitfalls, but we're adapting, and we will continue to adapt, even if we have to be dragged kicking and screaming all the way through it.
Thank you, Bea.
Thanks, Val.
So Bea, now we are going to move to our Q&A segment.
All
I
right.
have some questions that were submitted by our viewers. The first one is, I work in a restaurant and my coworkers are not wearing masks. What do? I don't want to report my company because I need my job and I don't want to, quote, get them in trouble.
Right. So first, document it. You know, if you keep a journal, if you keep a calendar, and just wherever you can, just document it. Submit your complaint to your employer in writing so that it's documented. But let your employer know you feel unsafe because your coworkers are not wearing their face masks and the employer is not enforcing it. You have to make that patently clear to the employer. Employer, if you get a complaint such as this, please take it seriously. Because again, we're seeing McDonald's getting faced with a giant public nuisance lawsuit simply for that reason. They have a policy that requires face masks, but it's not being enforced. So you can do a couple things just to show that you're actively enforcing it. Put signs up throughout your office building reminding employees to wear face masks. If you see an employee without a face mask, address it immediately. And McDonald's, one of the things that they have started doing immediately in light of this lawsuit was the managers immediately started holding what they call morning huddles. So every morning before they open the restaurant, everybody gets together, maintaining social distance, but for the managers to remind everybody, you absolutely have to stay 6 feet away from each other and you absolutely have to keep your mask on at all times. So things like that, just regular reminding, put signs up, make sure you have a policy. And for those employees who feel that despite the policy, it's not being enforced, you just have to put it in writing so that your employer is on notice unequivocally that you feel unsafe. And if it gets to the point where your employer is absolutely not doing anything, call OSHA. And OSHA will come in and investigate and will issue the appropriate penalties.
The second question is, I have an employee who called in sick and said he thinks he may have COVID. There's two parts to this question. First, how do I know what I can ask for by way of proof? And is there anything I can do to prevent employees who may be taking advantage of the COVID-19?
Excellent questions. Employees who claim they have COVID are entitled to emergency paid sick leave. If they want emergency paid sick leave, they must submit a doctor's note. So you absolutely can require a doctor's note. If they don't submit a doctor's note, you can deny the leave. Many employers are being reasonable, and when the employee calls in and says, I just left the doctor's office, I have COVID, the employer will say, all right, give us a doctor's note as soon as you can, and eventually the employee will turn one in. But if the employee never turns one in, you have no obligation to offer the employee emergency paid sick leave or any other leave. You can say to the employee, you can take your accrued sick time, you can take your accrued vacation time, but you're not going to receive the leaves you're entitled to under the CARES Act unless we get the appropriate documentation.
Can an employer take disciplinary action if they find out that that particular employee lied?
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
what could that look like in terms of discipline?
It could be a number of things. It could be a probation. It could be a write-up. It could be termination. If that employee lying caused a big negative impact on the company. And let me give you an example of when that happened. I had a client who had a group of employees who work out in a remote facility by themselves, and I think it's about 15, 20 guys who work out there by themselves. And the employer did not catch on to it at first, but after a while, there was a clear pattern of these guys taking every other week off. They would rotate. Okay, this is your week. Okay, this week you call in and say, you have a family member who thinks they were exposed and they brought it home. And then next week, okay, now you call in and say that your daughter went to visit a friend and brought it home. And now and by the way, this is what got the employer's attention. None of them ever actually called to say, I have COVID. I've been tested, test came back positive. It was always, I think I've been exposed. My daughter's been exposed. I was at a facility in which the other workers had it. So in a situation like that, where you really get the sense that something not right is happening, you have every right to go down there to the facility, look around, do your own investigation, and say to these employees, did you ever get sick? Or who is the sick family member? Or you can ask certain questions to get to the bottom of it. Remember, don't over-pry and get into really, really confidential areas of the employee's private life. But you can ask enough questions to determine whether these employees legitimately reported possible exposure to COVID-19 and legitimately used their leave benefits under the CARES Act. And if they didn't, you can absolutely discipline.
Great. The third question is looking forward to when we may have a vaccine. Do you see employers being allowed to require employees to get the vaccine before being at work?
Yes, absolutely. The EEOC clarified some guidelines that they had published earlier with respect to what employers can and cannot do in light of COVID-19. And the EEOC has specifically stated that employers may require testing of employees before employees are allowed back into the workplace. Now, at the time that these guidelines came out, the pandemic was fairly new. Testing was really not available if you were not sick. And so it was hard to say to employees, you must go get tested. But now testing sites are prevalent. Tests are available, and yes, many employers are actually requiring their employees to go get tested before they're allowed to return to work.
So the last area that I think would be a really great place to close on, V, is what are the real life scenarios that you've seen over the past 4 weeks, let's say, since we last convened for the first series?
Right. So like I said, the one client with the remote facility in which it seemed like everybody there at one time or another was being exposed and needing 10 days off to quarantine, but no one was ever really getting sick. In that case, that employer had a lot of questions. Do we have to pay for employees to sit home and wait for a test that will likely come back negative? My advice is you ought to prevent the possibility that you may be sued in the future for unfairly denying leave benefits. You ought to, and then if you find out later that this employee lied, you can discipline the employee later. But to the extent that you can, you should offer the benefits just so you avoid that legal pitfall that you'll have to deal with later. This employer also asked questions like, can we only pay wages to those employees that actually test positive? So all these guys that kept claiming they were being exposed and claiming that they went out to get tested and now they have to wait 14 days to quarantine while the test results come back. This employer was really wanting to say, all right, but those 14 days are unpaid until we see the positive test results. And we'll go back and we'll back pay. We'll pay you retroactively for anything we owe you. That's not a good practice. California law requires you to pay employees when they're due to be paid. You can't say we're not going to pay you until we see a positive test result and then retroactively pay you for that time. Just go about your business as usual. Do your investigation. If your investigation reveals that these guys are lying, then you can discipline them some other way. But don't withhold their wages. That's never, ever okay in California under any circumstances. This employer also asked whether they could just say to employees, if you want to go get tested, that's fine. If you're telling us you have to quarantine, that's fine. But until we see a doctor's note, we're not going to give you the leave. And that's perfectly lawful. You can do that.
And during a quarantine, you had mentioned earlier, and I will have this as your final question, that people may have to quarantine when they come back from vacation.
Yes.
Does that have to be covered by their paid time, whether it's characterized as vacation or PTO, or does an employer have an obligation to say, you have to quarantine, we'll pay you, and you'll be telecommuting during that period of time?
No. Remember, vacation time is something that's for the employee's benefit. It's not something that they're undertaking as a benefit to the employer. So the employer absolutely can say, this is time that you're taking off for your own benefit, but you're going somewhere that's high risk, and you're going somewhere where you could potentially be exposed to and catch COVID and then bring it back into the workplace, and we can't have that. So that allows the employer, and like we discussed, this pandemic, this virus has been declared a direct threat to human life. So that allows the employer a little bit more flexibility to say, if you don't have your own accrued vacation, if you don't have sufficient vacation time to cover not just your vacation time, but the 2 weeks of quarantine after, we can't approve your vacation. Or if you have to quarantine and you don't have enough vacation time to cover it, you have to telecommute. You have to work from home. We are not going to pay for you to sit home for 2 weeks to recover from your vacation.
Right. Thanks for that clarification, V. And thanks for all the information that you provided today. I think you've given employers and employees a lot to think about and a lot to consider as we, again, continue to navigate through our new normal. So thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar by Palm Springs Life in conjunction with SBEMP Attorneys at Law. Any questions that have been submitted will be addressed and sent out in the recap email with the video by Palm Springs Life. Stay safe, everybody.